Hello, welcome. This is our third lecture on Aristotle. And before we begin, I need to correct an error that we made in the first video. In the first video on Aristotle, we had talked about Alexander the Great, and I had mentioned that he had died at the age of 25. That is not accurate, so I do apologize. I am getting older, so all of these younger ages feel like they're the same to me. He died at about the age of 32, so off by 7 years. That's a significant error. I do apologize, but that's that. Today, we are going to begin looking at Book 2, or rather the selections that we have from Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics in our textbook. And we're starting here on page 66. So we're taking up the thread. So in Book 1, we kind of outlined the scope, right? Why is he doing? What is this book about ethics? What is it about? And it turns out that it's about how to be a human being, right? How to live well with other people, and it is kind of exploring the purpose of a human being. What is a human being for? So a human being is for eudaimonia, or blessed happiness. And then the rest of the text is going to be kind of sketching out what that is. So in Book 1, Aristotle told us that the highest art is politics, right? And politics is the art of living well with one another. And if we look at all of the various ways in which you do that, all the various arts, we find that the thing that all of them are subordinate to, or the higher end that all of them contribute to, is the end of happiness, or eudaimonia. And so that's where we are at. Okay, so let's pick up Book 2. It starts in a really interesting way because it's going to tell us where we get the word ethics from. That's the first thing that he does. So there, already on the top of page 66, he says, virtue then, being of two kinds, intellectual and moral. Intellectual virtue in the main owes both its birth and its growth to teaching, for which reason it requires experience and time, while moral virtue comes about as a result of habit, whence also its name, ethike, is one that is formed by a slight variation from the word ethos, or habit. And so this is where we come. So we're talking about moral virtue. We're going to be talking about ethics, or in the Greek, ethike. And this comes from a slight modification of the word ethos. And ethos is the word that means habit, or it means custom. So ethics, then, which is connected to virtue, ethics are the habits that are formed to desire and to do the right thing. So it's ethics are being in the habit of doing the right thing. And that's why virtue ethics is so connected with concepts like character, and concepts like doing well, and concepts like being a, quote, good person, because it's not about following the rules as much as it's having the right disposition. And so virtue ethics has kind of been explained in some ways as being habituated to desiring what is good, or learning to love the right things, the good things. And that's where we're at. That's where we get the word ethics from. This is an important thing to know, that ethics, in a sense, it means good habits. And virtues are those habits that are the good things, right? So he continues. He says, for nothing exists by nature, can form a habit contrary to its nature, right? So he's saying there's nothing that can form a habit contrary to its nature. And so we form habits all the time. And this might sound kind of counterintuitive to us, because we might form this habit of trying to wake up earlier in the day, or trying to eat a healthier diet, or of trying to go exercise every day, or not putting off doing our studies. These might be new habits, and we might feel like we're fighting our own nature to do that. But Aristotle says that we're not. We're not fighting our nature when we try to form good habits. What we're doing is we're cooperating We're cooperating with our natures. Because remember that for Aristotle, this is all part of this large system where everything works together towards the good. The good are the things that we naturally desire. And if you think about that, it makes sense, because when you try to form new habits, it's because the old habits that you have aren't working to help you get the things that you want. So if you try to form a habit of waking up earlier in the morning, it's because your older habit of waking up late is costing you something. And it's costing you something that you don't like. It could be missed opportunities. It could be that you got fired from jobs. It could be that it causes you to do poorly in your classes. It could be any number of things, but there's something there that's making you want to change. And the same thing could be said for healthy eating or exercising or studying better or whatever it is. There's a good that you're desiring, and that's why you're trying to form a different habit, because you're trying to figure out the way to cooperate with your nature. Aristotle expands on this. He says, for instance, the stone which by nature moves downward, right, because the stone itself is inert. Stones are potential. They have more potential in them than actuality, because they in themselves are motionless, and they're drawn towards the center of the earth. They're drawn to stillness, right? So the stone, by its nature, cannot be habituated to move upward, not even if one tries to train it by throwing it up 10,000 times. Nor can fire be habituated to move downwards, right? And this is something that we are familiar with here, because we try to move fire downwards here all the time, right? Because that's heat. And in the wintertime, you've got a heater, and what does heat do? It wants to move up the chimney, right? It wants to move up the vent always. And so we try to habituate that fire, that warm air, to go someplace else. And we, might put in ceiling fans, or we might put in insulation to kind of trap it. But always, always, it's going to be in that nature of the fire or the warm air to want to escape. And for Aristotle, this was a physical principle, not just a physical principle, but a metaphysical principle, because fire moves. There's motion, and that motion in fire is what is drawing it upwards, right? So he says that you can throw that rock up in the air, it's always going to come down. You're never going to throw it enough times that it's going to change its habit and fly, because you can't habituate things to do something that is against their very nature. So in our example here, like if you're trying to habituate yourself to getting up earlier in the morning, eventually you'll succeed, because that's something that's part of your nature. You can do that one, right? But just like there are others that you can't do. I think that there are probably any number of, 8 or 9-year-old boys who watch these Star Wars movies, and they will try and they'll try and they'll try to use the Force to move things, and they're never going to be successful, because that's not a habit that we can form that comports to our nature as human beings. But waking up early is one. So um, that's one that you have a better chance of being successful with. But why is he doing this? Why does he make this distinction? It's because virtue for Aristotle is something that is natural, and it's a cooperation with nature that is going to help us get towards our end of eudaimonia, right? Of happiness. He continues then, he says, neither by nature then, nor contrary to nature, do the virtues arise in us. Rather, we are adapted by nature to receive them, and are made perfect by habit. We are made perfect by habit. So this is something that we have to work on. And we know this fits with our experience, that we do have to work on cultivating good habits within ourselves. And we do. We all work on those, and the hope is that as we work on the habit of, say, getting up early, that at some point it will become easier for us. That in fact we will sleep through the night, and then we will wake up at the right time. And the same thing happens with making sure that we study every day, or we get exercise every day, or that we eat a healthy diet. As we acculturate ourselves to these behaviors that we want to um, follow, they will get easier and easier and easier until our personal desires, or our bodily desires, align with what we have set out for ourselves, what we have planned for ourselves, so we can be made perfect that way. And Aristotle talks about this. It's still on the same page a little bit farther down. He says, the virtues we get first by exercising them, as also happiness in the case of the arts as well. For the things we have to learn before we have to do them, we learn by doing them. For example, men become builders by building, and lyre players by playing the lyre. So too, we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, and brave by doing brave acts. So we exercise them, and it really is a kind of training, right? So Aristotle is going to talk about the importance of training the young people in the virtues so that they can become excellent, right? So they can have good character, that we train them, and we have to practice doing things. So one of the things that we do is, and I'm sure you remember this from your childhood, and if you don't later on when you have children, you'll do this with your kids. Trust me, that every kid at some point will do something wrong to another kid, right? They might do something mean, they might push, they might shove, they might take away a toy, and then they get caught. And what does the good parent do? The good parent then helps the child to learn to be virtuous by having them do an action, right? So if they offend another child, or they take away a toy, right? So they take away a toy unjustly. So the good parent, the instructor of the child, is going to go in and tell the child, now you give that back, and you apologize. You tell him you're sorry. So what's going on here? The child is learning the virtue by doing the action. Right? This is what Aristotle is talking about, this kind of thing, right? When he says, for the things we have to learn before we can do them, we learn by doing them, right? And then he talks about the analogy to the virtuous men, right? By talking about builders learn by building, and lyre players learn by playing the lyre. So we should probably talk about what that is, because not everybody knows what a lyre is. So a lyre is an ancient Greek instrument that is looks like a harp. So it's a type of a harp. Okay. And then still on page 66, right, he says, this is confirmed by what happens in states. For legislators make the citizens good by forming habits in them, and this is the wish of every legislator, and those who do not effect it miss their mark. And it is in this that a good constitution differs from a bad one. Right? So this is the job of the legislator, is to make the citizenry good. And we see this also in our own time. This is why we have such big fights and arguments about what's going on in public education, because public education is the mechanism whereby we inculcate virtuous habits in our citizenry. That's the primary way that we do it. And so we argue about it a lot. And then what do we find? So first of all, we argue about it a lot, which shows that we're still doing the thing that Aristotle said was important. But then the second kind of the interesting thing is that you can know something important about a society. You can know what values they think are the most excellent by looking at what they do in their elementary schools, what they do in their public education. This tells you what the values are. So, for example, in Finland, right, their education system is very different. Those kids spend a lot of time outside. They have a lot of unstructured time. They don't have a lot of homework. And it's a different educational experience. And that tells us something about what the people in Finland value, right? They value unstructured time. They value creativity. They value kind of independence, right? Because the kids have to figure out ways to occupy their own time. Um, One of the things they don't value as much in Finland that really is a clear value of that's shown in the American education system is Americans value hard work, right? So when we get to American schools, we can do something. We can look at all the homework assignments that are given, and not all of them are um, important to learning, right? The Finnish students learn the information as well, if not better, than the American students, and they don't have homework. So why do Americans have the homework? Well, part of the reason the Americans have the homework is because one of the things they value is the ability to work hard at a task. Whereas the Finns, they don't value that as much. They value kind of creativity more so than the hard work. So Aristotle knows something about human beings, because this comment about legislators helping people to develop the virtues um, it really is true. It was true in his time. It's also true in our time that we spend so much time talking about public schooling and what students should learn and how they should learn and what kind of activities they should do, that um, it's clear. It's clear. Okay. So he follows this thread for a while, and then on page 67, he says, thus, in one word, states of character arise out of like activities. This is why the activities we exhibit must be of a certain kind. It is because the states of character correspond to the differences between these. It makes no small difference, then, whether we form habits of one kind or another from our very youth. It makes a very great difference, or rather, all the difference. Right? So he's talking about the importance of forming habits in young people. It makes all the difference, right? It doesn't make a small difference what habits we form. It makes all the difference, right? It's not a small difference. It's not a great difference. It's all the difference, because virtue is good habits. We have to form good habits in people. That's what is going to lead us, each individual person, to eudaimonia, and it's also going to lead the whole society into a state where it is flourishing, right? Where it is flourishing. And then in section 2, that's section 1, there's a lot there. In section 2, he's going to change gears, right? He's going to say, since then the present inquiry does not aim at theoretical knowledge like the others, right? For we are inquiring not in order to know what virtue is, but in order to become good, since otherwise our inquiry would have been of no use. We must examine the nature of actions, namely, how we ought to do them, for these determine also the nature of the states of character that are produced, as we have said. Right, so he's not aiming at theoretical knowledge, but knowledge of how to do the activities. So he's going to switch then to from his inquiry, right? So his inquiry was about what a human being is for, right? And a human being is for being virtuous, because virtuous is blessed happiness. And then he's saying, well, the virtues are habituated. They're put there by habits. They're customs or habits that are put into people, and it makes all the difference what kind of habits young people form, because it tells us whether or not they're going to be happy people later on, right? But then he says that's not enough. It's not enough to know that. We want to have a good idea of what the practical knowledge of what virtue is, right? So how do we do it, right? This is a practical, because I'm almost like a how-to manual. How do we do it? What is the virtuous behavior? How do we figure that out? Okay. Um, and he says, and this is on page 68, right, was where he's going to begin this inquiry. He says, first then, let us consider this, that it is the nature of such things to be destroyed by defect and excess, as we see in the case of strength and health. For to gain light on things imperceptible, we must use the evidence of sensible things. Both excessive and defective exercise destroys the strength, and similarly, food or drink, which is above or below a certain amount, destroys health, while that which is proportionate both produces and increases and preserves it. So what is he talking about? He's saying, well, let's look at the world. So he wants to know kind of what virtue is. He's looking for a practical guide to know what the virtuous states are. And he says, let's look at the world first. And one of the things that he's going to notice when he looks at the world is that things are destroyed by excess and defect. They're destroyed. And there's something between excess and defect that promotes the good of the thing. So he says, let's look at health and eating. Right? So health is promoted by exercise. We know that. But he says, if we look at it, we'll notice that too little exercise, a defect of exercise, is detrimental to the health. We know that if you never exercise, the body becomes weak and you can't do things anymore. Right? The health declines. But he also notices that if you exercise too much, then your health declines then too. Right? So if people are basically they people are worked to death, right? If you do too much, if you don't let your body rest, right? If you aren't getting sufficient nutrition, if you are driven kind of like a slave, we don't work people this hard anymore. But if you're driven excessively by exercise, you get too much of it, your health will decline, it will diminish. Right? And he says eating is the same way, right? If you don't get enough to eat, you'll starve. And then if you get too much to eat, you'll be obese and flabby and fat, and your health will decline. So in both cases, your health declines. So he says, both in this case of exercise and in this case of eating, there's something in between excess and deficiency that's what is promoting the good, right? And that's where he's going to find stuff. He's going to head in this direction for a long time. He says, so too it is then in the case of temperance and courage and other virtues, right? So just like a healthy body is promoted by something in between deficient in excess of exercise and deficient in excess of eating, so too it is with the virtues, right? Temperance and courage and the other virtues. It says, for the man who flies from the man who flies from and fears everything and does not stand his ground against anything becomes a coward. Right? So this is somebody who's got a defect of bravery, right? A defect of bravery, he's a coward. Right? And the man who fears nothing at all but goes to meet every danger becomes rash. Right? And so we know we've seen the rash person, right? We know people in our lives probably who like to pick fights with other people. Right? Flies into danger for no reason. This is not the virtue of bravery, right? The virtue of bravery is somewhere between those. He says, and similarly, the man who indulges in every pleasure and abstains from none becomes self-indulgent. So he's talking about the person who's got a defect of temperance, who indulges as much as possible in the pleasures of food and drink, right? While the man who shuns every pleasure, as boors do, becomes in a way insensible, right? So teetotalers, right? People who have an uncultivated palate, they miss something important about what food and drink are by finding no pleasure there at all, right? So temperance and courage, just like health, are destroyed by excess and defect and preserved by the mean. And so this is an important concept in Aristotle, the mean, or sometimes it's called the golden mean. And the golden mean is where the virtue is. So the virtue of courage is between the vice of defect, which is cowardice, and the vice of rashness, which is excess. And the virtue of temperance is the mean between the vice of self-satisfaction, right, or self-indulgence, um, and the um, vice of boorishness, of finding no pleasure at all, right? And this is an important concept. And so when I'm not teaching by sitting in front of a camera on a computer, I draw something on the board, and I'll like draw a line, and I'll have excess and defect on one side and the other, and then in the middle I'll have virtue as the golden mean, right? I'll have virtue as the golden mean. So he continues this analogy between health and virtue as he kind of goes on this page, right? He says, but not only are the sources and causes of their origination and growth the same as those of their destruction, but also the sphere of their actualization will be the same. For this is also true of the things which are more evident to sense. For example, strength is produced by taking much food and undergoing much exertion. And so it is the strong man that will be most able to do these things, right? So we know that. If you exercise well and you eat well, you're going to be strong, right? He says, so too it is with the virtues. By abstaining from pleasures, we become temperate, right? And we should probably say a word about temperance, because temperance is not something that we're used to talking about. So in this country, if you're acquainted with the history of the United States, you'll know that we had a temperance movement that kind of started about the 1890s, and then peaked in the 20s when we had prohibition. So the temperance movement was a movement in the United States against alcohol specifically. And the people who were part of this temperance movement, they formed temperance societies, and they made things that, like they made like the total abstainer pledge. That's where we get the term teetotaler from, right? So a teetotaler was somebody who had made the total abstainer pledge, and this comes from the temperance movement, and they pledged to stop drinking, and then the temperance movement kind of reaches crescendo when we had, I think, the amendment to the Constitution outlawing alcohol everywhere, right? Um, and so we in this country associate temperance as being the same thing as total abstinence from alcohol, and that's not historically what the word means, and it's not what it means in Aristotle. Aristotle is talking about temperance as being the state that is a state of moderation in bodily pleasures, right? And so one of those bodily pleasures has to do with drinking alcohol, right? He's for moderation there. One of those bodily pleasures has to do with eating rich foods or good foods, and he's for moderation there. And then another one of those moderations that would fit under the category of temperance for Aristotle would be sexual pleasure, right? So he's for moderation there, right? So in Aristotle, the temperate man is going to be against drunkenness, because drunkenness would be a vice of excess. Actually, it'd be a vice of defect. You'd be a defect of temperance, right? Because it would be the self-indulgent person. Drunkenness is a vice, right? But total abstention from alcohol, or to be a total abstainer or a teetotaler, that would also be a vice, right? because you have these two extremes. Where's the other hand? There it is. You have the two extremes, and both of them are vices, right? The total abstainer is a vice, and the drunkard is also a vice. But the person who can be moderate in the consumption of alcohol, maybe have a glass of wine with dinner, right? That's the one who's virtuous, right? That's the one who's virtuous, because that's where the golden mean is. So let's go back to our reading now that we said something about temperance, because he's going to talk a lot about that, right? He says, so too it is with the virtues. By abstaining from pleasures, we become temperate. So if you have a problem with drunkenness, right, or you have a problem with gluttony, or you have a problem with I don't know, some kind of sexual addiction or something, then we can strengthen the other side through abstaining from pleasures, right? We can strengthen the other side through abstaining from pleasures. And the goal isn't to eliminate that. The goal is to achieve the mean, right? He says, and similarly, too, in the case of courage. For by being habituated to despise things that are terrible and to stand our ground against them, we become brave. And it is when we have become brave that we shall most be able to stand our ground against them. Right? So it's this case in the middle. And he's talking about how we do it. We practice. The virtues are practiced. The virtues are built. The virtues are exercised. And so it's very much like a state of health. To have excellent health of the body, you have to exercise your muscles, and then you'll have good health. To have excellent character, you have to exercise. And then when you exercise your virtues, then you'll be a virtuous person. You'll have good character. Right? And so this is why there's a lot of people who really are into virtue ethics who will talk really highly and favorably about sports and athletics, because they'll see this as a way of exercising the virtue. So if you for example, you're playing football, if you're playing football, one of the things that's going to happen is that you're going to have to hit people, and you're going to get hit. And this helps you to acquire the virtue of bravery. It makes it easier to stand your ground. Literally, in football, you're defending a piece of ground against the advancement of a ball. So you're practicing this virtue. And then also for athletics, you have to practice the virtue of temperance. You have to be moderate. You can't go out and like booze it up the night before a game, or it's going to affect your performance. You have to eat the right foods. You can't be gluttonous. Right? But at the same time, you have to have enough calories to be able to sustain yourself through your athletic performance or the game. Right? So everything is about the mean. It's about moderation. At the bottom of page 68, there in section 3, he says, for moral excellence is concerned with pleasures and pains. It is on account of the pleasure that we do bad things, and account on the pain that we abstain from the noble ones. Hence, we ought to have been brought up in a particular way from our youth, as Plato says, so as both to delight in and to be pained by things that we ought. For this is the right education. Right? It goes to the sports. People like winning. And when you can learn to associate moderation and effort and hard work with the pleasure of winning, then you learn to like, or at least to tolerate well, things like early morning practice. Okay? So virtue ethics, I think it fits a lot with our experience of things. Okay, so we're going to skip ahead a little bit. I want to talk a little bit more about the golden mean, right? The golden mean. Because there's going to be a lot more talk about that. There's going to be a lot more talk about that. So one of the things that people have called Aristotle, and this is not like a, it's not that they've historically called him this. We don't find a long tradition, going back 1,000 years of people calling him this, but we do find that in the past few decades, people have taught Aristotle by calling him the Goldilocks of moral philosophy. The Goldilocks of moral philosophy. It's because he's got this focus on the mean. He's got this focus on the mean. The mean between the vices of excess and defect. Right? So we talk about him like Goldilocks. So I want to remind you of the story of Goldilocks and the three bears. Right? So this is a story I'm sure all of you heard when you were children. But the story of Goldilocks and the three bears, that there was this little girl named Goldilocks, and she was out in the woods for a walk, and she came across this cottage, right? And the cottage was the cottage that belonged to the three bears, and the three bears had set out their breakfast, and the three bears themselves had gone for a walk in the forest while their breakfast cooled. And Goldilocks came into the cottage while they were gone. And there on the table, she saw 3 bowls of porridge, right? 3 bowls of porridge, and she was hungry, so she tasted them. And she tasted the first bowl of porridge, and it was too hot. And then she tasted the second bowl of porridge, and it was too cold, right? And then she tasted the third bowl of porridge, and it was just right, so she ate it all up. So we have in the porridge, we have the first bowl of porridge is too hot. That's a vice of excess. The second bowl of porridge is too cold. That's a vice of defect. The third bowl of porridge is just right. That's the golden mean, and she ate it. Right? And then she went and she sat in the chairs, and the first chair was too hard. The second chair was too soft. The third chair was just right. She went upstairs to the beds because she was now tired because she had eaten their breakfast. And the first bed that she laid in was too hard. And the second bed she laid in was too soft. And the third bed she laid in was just right. And she fell asleep, right? So we had one bed that was the excess of deficiency, the excess of defect, and the other bed that was the excess of excess, right? The vice of excess, right? The defect of excess. And then the third bed was just right. So it was the golden mean. Too hard, too soft, just right. So what happened when she found the thing that was just right? She found the virtue of sleep, right? Because she found the bed that was the right one. And then the rest of the story of Goldilocks doesn't kind of follow this model, because the bears come home and the little girl realizes that she shouldn't be trespassing, and they frighten her away, and she runs out the window and is never heard from again, right? Or depending on what version of the story you read, I'm sure there's some where she gets eaten by the bear and they find that Goldilocks is neither too hard or too soft, but she's just right. But the point of the story is that it illustrates this principle where you have an excess and a defect and a golden mean. Right? And this is where Aristotle finds the virtue. It's the mean between the excess and the defect. Okay, it's the mean between the excess and the defect. But before he goes into that more, he's going to talk about some other things, and so we're going to listen to him. Right? On page 70, kind of the third paragraph down, he says, that virtue then is concerned with pleasures and pains, and that by the acts from which it arises is both increased and, if they are done differently, destroyed, and the acts from which it arose are those in which it actualizes itself. Let this be taken as said. What is he talking about? He's talking about the rule of pleasure and pain. Right? The rule of pleasure and pain. We have to learn how to find pleasure in the good thing. Right? Find pleasure in the good thing. right? It says the question, this is right there on page 70 by the number 4 there. So the question might be asked, what we mean by saying that we must become just by doing just acts, and temperate by doing temperate acts. For if men do just and temperate acts, they are already just and temperate, exactly as if they do what is in accordance with the laws of grammar and music, they are grammarians and musicians, right? And this is an argument that you will have with children, right? This is an argument that you'll have with children. Well, I did the right thing, so I'm the good person, right? I made the right decision there, so I must be a person of good character, right? But we know that that's not the case. One good decision does not make you a person of virtue. One good action does not make you a person of virtue. It takes training, right? And we see this in sports, right? We see this in sports. Sometimes the beginner in sports will do some sort of an amazing play, right? Or they'll score an unexpected goal, or they'll do something that is excellently brilliant in some way. But that doesn't mean that they're proficient. It means that they are beginning to get experience, right? And he clarifies this on page 71. He says, actions then are called just and temperate when they are such as the just or temperate man would do, right? Actions are just and temperate when they are such that the just or temperate man would do. But it is not the man who does these that is just and temperate, but the man who also does them as just and temperate men do them. It is well said then that it is by doing just acts that the just man is produced, and that by doing temperate acts, the temperate man, without doing these, no one would have even a prospect of becoming good. So we have to exercise. We have to cultivate virtue within ourselves in order to achieve it. Okay? We're going to skip ahead a little bit. On 72, right before we get to number 6, he comes to the conclusion that virtues are neither passions nor faculties, but rather they are states of character. States of character. People who are proponents of virtue ethics as the best moral theory are people who talk about good character. This sometimes enters into our political discourse when people will talk about character as being important. You don't want to have a president, somebody who would do such and such type of behavior, whatever it is. The implicit thing there is that character is important. That you need to have a person of high good character, a person who finds pleasure in doing the right type of things. And that's going to affect who they are. Okay. So we're going to get back to the question of the mean, and we're going to turn over to page 73. All right, we're going to turn over to page 73 because he's going to draw another analogy. So we had the analogy of health and exercise and eating, but he's going to give us another analogy, and it's about the work of art. And this is the part that well, there's a section there that's in parentheses that we're going to mostly focus on here. He says, so that we often say of good works of art that it is not possible either to take away or to add anything, implying that excess and defect destroys the goodness of the works of art, while the mean preserves it. And good artists, as we say, look to this in their work. So he's going back to trying to defend the concept of the mean as where virtue lies. And I think that this concept of the work of art being harmed by excess or defect is something that we get. So anybody who is like a fan of the Star Wars movies, they understand this, right? Because the first Star Wars movie was produced in 1977, right? And then I think there was another one in the early 80s, and then 84 I think was Return of the Jedi. So it was of that vintage. And then George Lucas, 10 or 20 years later, decided to go in and re-edit things. And he made some substantive changes to his work of art. And there are people who thought that the first set of movies was better and superior, and that by removing some things and adding other things, that George Lucas took this work of art that he had made, and he made it worse, that he destroyed the good thing that was there. So I think that we get this. If anybody's ever been upset about people who go in and re-edit things later to make them worse, you know what he's talking about here. The good work of art is destroyed either when you take something away from it or you add something to it, right? So he concludes that paragraph, says, now virtue is concerned with passions and actions in which excess is a form of failure and so is defect, while the intermediate is praised and is a form of success, and being praised and being successful are both characteristics of virtue. Therefore, virtue is a kind of mean, since, as we have seen, it aims at what is intermediate. He's going to have a few of these kinds of expressions, right? On page 74, right? He says there in the top, and it's kind of bracketed out, men are good in one way, but bad in many. And he says right after that, virtue then is a state of character concerned with choice lying in a mean. That is, the mean relative to us, this being determined by a rational principle, and by that principle by which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. Okay, this is important. Because remember, last week when we read and discussed the Euthyphro, we talked about the importance of the application of reason to the question of ethics, and how our prior systems of ethics, which were based upon religion and tradition and superstition, didn't have the application of reason, right? And here is where Aristotle puts it in, right? He put it in on our last lecture because we were using reason to figure out what a human being is for. But then here it comes back, right? When he says that the mean relative to us is determined by a rational principle, and by that principle by which the man of practical wisdom would determine it, right? We're using our rational faculties to figure out where the mean is. He says, now it is a mean between two vices, that which depends on excess and that which depends on defect. And again, it is a mean because the vices respectively fall short of or exceed what is right in both passions and actions, while virtue both finds and chooses that which is intermediate. Hence, in respect of its substance and of the definition which states its essence, virtue is a mean with regard to what is best and right and extreme. So virtue is a mean between vice and excess, right? And so then on page 75, he's going to start talking about some of the virtues in particular, right? And what are the vices of excess and defect, and what the virtue is, right? So he starts there on page 75, kind of halfway down the first paragraph, right? And he says, with regard to feelings of fear and confidence, courage is the mean. So with regard to feelings of fear and confidence, courage is the mean. That's the virtue. Courage is the mean. Of the people who exceed, he who exceeds in fearlessness has no name. So we could call it the rash person, but we don't really have a name for that type of person. Many of the states have no name. So don't use this as an objection to Aristotle. He knows this already. So many of the states of defect don't have a name. But that doesn't mean that the vice isn't there and that it's not something that we can recognize. We do recognize the person who has a defect of excess confidence, right? While the man who exceeds in confidence is rash, and he who exceeds in fear and falls short in confidence is a coward, right? So this is one of the virtues. Then he's going to go down to the next one at the beginning of the next paragraph. With regard to giving and taking money, the mean is liberality, right? The virtue is liberality, being liberal with your money. The excess and defect, prodigality, and meanness, right? So the one who is liberal appropriately is free with his money, right? The one who is prodigal, right, wastes his money away. And the one who is mean, or we might use the word miserly, hoards his money, right? And prodigality and meanness are both vices, and liberality is the virtue, right? He continues there. He says, let's go down to the next paragraph, right? With regard to honor and dishonor, the mean is proper pride. The excess is known as a sort of empty vanity, and the deficiency is undue humility, right? So we know that. We know the proper pride, that those are people we know in our lives who've done great things, and they have kind of a feeling of satisfaction about them. And then we certainly know the person who has empty vanity, right? Who has this groundless pride. But we may also know the person who's on the other vice, who suffers from undue humility, who doesn't take credit for the things that they have done and suffers because of it, right? So we have here excess, virtue, deficiency, right? And he goes through a lot of these, right? He goes through a lot of these, and I want you to kind of read them all. We'll pick out a couple of more here, right? On 77 at the top, he talks about the virtue of friendliness. He says, the man who is pleasant in the right way is friendly, and the mean is friendliness. While the man who exceeds is an obsequious person, if he has no end in view, a flatterer if he is aiming at his own advantage, and the man who falls short is unpleasant in all circumstances, and is quarrelsome and a surly type of person. So we see that excess and deficiency, right? The excess is obsequious or a flatterer, right? The mean is the friendly person, and the one who falls short, the defect, is unpleasant, quarrelsome, and surly. And what's the virtue? The virtue is friendly. Okay? And then in the next paragraph, right? He says, for even in these matters, one man is said to be intermediate and another man to exceed, as for the instance of the bashful man who is ashamed of everything, right? While he who falls short or is not ashamed of anything at all is shameless, and the intermediate person is modest. Right? Righteous indignation is a mean between envy and spite. Right? And these states are concerned with the pain and pleasures that are felt at the fortunes of our neighbors. Right? The man who is characterized by righteous indignation is pained at undeserved good fortune. The envious man, going beyond him, is pained at all good fortune. And the spiteful man falls so far short of being pained that he even rejoices. Right? So read through this section. We're just highlighting a couple of these things where he talks about excess and deficiency. Let's skip forward to page 48 there on point 9 at the bottom of the page. He says, the moral virtue then, so the moral virtue is a mean. Then, and in what sense it is so, and that it is a mean between two vices, the one involving excess and the other involving deficiency, and that such it is, and that it is such because its character is to aim at what is intermediate in passions and in actions, and it has been sufficiently stated. Right? It has been sufficiently stated. So he's going to spend a lot of the rest of the book then kind of unpacking what that means. Okay, so I want to say a few words about why it's the mean, right? Because we have these natural inclinations, right? And you have to remember that the whole system of Aristotle is natural. So we have these natural inclinations, and we can have too much of them or too little of them. And if we have too much of them, because you have to remember that we're drawn to the good, right? And it's like we're trying to hit a target. We're trying to hit a target with our behavior. And if we have too much of the passion, too much of the desire that is trying to get us to the next level, we're going to miss the mark. And if we have too little of it, we're going to miss the mark. In both cases, we'll miss. We have to have something moderate in the middle to be able to hit that mark, right? That's how we do it. So that's why there's this focus on moderation and this focus on the golden mean, right? He says on page 79, he says, for in everything it is no easy task to find the middle, right? That's why we have to practice. For example, he says, to find the middle of a circle is not for everyone, but for him who knows. Right? That's true. To find the exact middle. You can be trained. And actually, you were trained in high school how to find the exact middle of a circle. You should be able to do this. You do this compass, right? And you make arcs above and below, and you can bisect a different direction, and then you know the middle. You can be trained to do it, but not everybody can. And if you get somebody who just guesses, right, guess at the target, you're not going to hit it. Some people might, but most people won't. And the people who are going to hit it are going to either be the people who know how to do it or the people who are most well practiced, right? He says, anyone can get angry, that is easy, or give or spend money. But to do this to the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, with the right motive, and in the right way, that is not for everyone, nor is it easy. Wherefore goodness is both rare and laudable and noble. Goodness is rare and laudable and noble, and it takes real knowledge. All right, so let's turn over to page 80, right? And this is going to be close. We're gonna do a separate lecture on book 3. The excerpt that we have from book 3 is pretty short. That's probably going to be a shorter lecture. And then we're going to do another lecture on what he has to say about friendship, which is not in our excerpts here, but I think is something that is good and relatable to everyone. But so let's finish up here on page 80. He says, the man, however, who deviates little from goodness is not blamed, whether he do so in the direction of the more or of the less. but only the man who deviates more widely, for he does not fail to be noticed, right? So this is the other really good thing about the mean, right? If you don't have to be exactly in the center, right? So exactly in the center is here, right? But if you're just there, people aren't going to really notice, right? See the difference? They're not really going to notice if you're just off one way or you're just off the other way. But if you're over here, they're going to notice, right? Because the mean is kind of, it's like this range, and this fits with our intuition, right? You can have somebody you know is a good person and they can do something that's just a little bit off, but you say, they're still all right. But then if they do something crazy, you're like, what's wrong? That person is really off. He says, but up to what point and to what extent a man must deviate before he becomes blameworthy, it is not easy to determine by reasoning, any more than anything else that is perceived by the senses. Such things depend upon particular facts, and the decision rests with perception. So much then is plain that the intermediate state is in all things to be praised, but that we must incline sometimes toward the excess and sometimes toward the deficiency, so far as we shall most easily hit the mean and what is right. Right? And so that's the other thing about the mean, and that goes back to what we were saying earlier, that if you have a tendency one way or the other, right, excess or deficiency, you can do things to try to pull yourself to kind of hone in on the target. And if you overcorrect by just a little bit, you're still closer to the mean than you were when you were way over here, right? You might not be exactly center if you're overcorrect, but you're so much closer. So that's all we want to talk about for today. That covers most of the selection that we had for book 2 in our textbook. We will have another lecture on book 3. It might be a day or two before it's ready, and it's going to be shorter because our excerpt on book 3 is short, and then we'll have even another lecture, I think, and it's also going to be a shorter one about what Aristotle has to say about friendship in other parts of the book that you're not going to be reading.